We begin the day with the U.S. government closed until further notice. A showdown on Capitol Hill over a new budget, including money to keep health care costs from exploding further, turned into a shutdown at 12:01 a.m. Wednesday. Despite controlling both houses of Congress, Republicans did not have enough votes to get a funding bill passed in time. And now the blame game has begun.
The Democrats want to shut it down, so when you shut it down, you have to do layoffs. So we'd be laying off a lot of people that are going to be very affected, and the Democrats, they're going to be Democrats. We're doing well as a country, so the last thing we want to do is shut it down, but a lot of good can come down from shutdowns. We can get rid of a lot of things that we didn't want, and they'd be Democrat things.
Trump admitted himself that he is using Americans as political pawns. He is admitting that he is doing the firing of people if, God forbid, it happens. Democrats do not want a shutdown.
And for more, I'm joined now by Jennifer Nicoll Victor. She's an associate professor of political science at George Mason University in Northern Virginia. Professor, it's good to have you on the program. If you could help our viewers understand here, the Republicans, they control Congress, so why couldn't they pass this spending bill and avoid a shutdown?
Right. So the Republican Party does have a majority of seats in both chambers of Congress, the House and the Senate. But the spending bill requires a supermajority vote from the United States Senate. So that means they need to have 60 out of 100 votes in order to pass the bill. And the Republicans currently have just 53 seats. In the last vote yesterday, there was one Republican that defected to the Democratic side, and there were 3 Democrats that defected to the Republican side. So that meant the vote fell, whatever that math adds up to, a handful of votes of meeting the requirement that it needed to pass.
The last government shutdown was during President Trump's first term, and we remember it was all about funding the wall along the border with Mexico. Now, for our viewers who may not follow U.S. politics closely, tell us, what is the showdown about this time around?
Yeah, it's interesting. We don't often see government shutdowns when we have unified one party that controls all branches of government. But in this case, it is this filibuster, this supermajority rule in the Senate that is helping the Democrats to be able to force a shutdown. The Republicans were asking for what often the majority party winds up asking for in these situations, which is what is sometimes known as a clean continuing resolution, or a clean CR, which is just the stopgap bill that can keep government funded until they work out the more permanent negotiations for funding everything for the fiscal year. So what we have is a situation where Democrats have come under quite a lot of criticism from their constituents for not providing sufficient pushback against the various activities that the Trump administration has been doing that have been decimating the federal government, and lots of claims of doing things outside of the law and outside of the purview of what Congress typically has authority for. And so Democrats are using the leverage that they have in this funding opportunity to show a spine and show that they can oppose something. Coincidentally, there is also a healthcare provision that is going to expire at the end of the year that, if it is not fixed, millions of Americans are going to lose access to their health insurance. So what Democrats are doing right now is withholding their votes needed in order to get this bill passed and asking in exchange for the funding fix for healthcare, which is technically not included in this funding, in the shutdown-oriented funding bill. So we'll have to see how long that negotiating stance stands out.
Let me ask you, too, about that. If Americans see their health care premiums go up as a result of this, who are they going to blame at election time? Are they going to blame the Democrats or the Republicans?
Yeah, that's a fair question. The surveys on this topic suggest that there might be more blame coming towards Republicans should that happen, that the public generally tends to favor Democrats when it comes to things like managing of social welfare resources like healthcare. That being said, we're a pretty long way in political terms from the next election. Next congressional election is not until November 2026, and voters tend to have short memories. So whether or not whatever happens in this shutdown or the policies related to it wind up affecting the election next year is really just too far out to say that we think it might have an impact.
Let's talk for a moment about the people who are directly impacted by this shutdown, federal workers. I want you to take a listen to what the head of the National Federation of Federal Employees is saying about the impact of government shutdowns. Take a listen.
We are doing damage to our ability to recruit and retain the talent that we need in this government for decades to come, because people will remember being disrespected in this way. People don't want to sit in a constant state of agitation or being fired for doing their jobs, being fired because somebody knows what your politics are. There are political witch hunts happening in this government that never happened before.
So, Professor, could President Trump, could he really use this shutdown to slash more government jobs as he is threatening? I mean, he's even threatened to fire federal employees who are Democrats.
I mean, if you had asked me this question a year ago, I would say no, that it's Congress's power to affect all of that funding and how that money is allocated. But what we've seen in the last number of months of the Trump administration is the president and his bureaucratic agents doing all sorts of things that are outside what we would have normally considered the rule of law. And we've seen a plethora of lawsuits and so forth. But what we haven't seen is the Congress putting a check on the power of this executive. So in sort of normal times, I would have said that no, the president cannot do that. But this president threatening it is a fairly credible threat. And it sort of seems like unless somebody holds him to account and says, actually, you don't have the legal authority to do that, then he probably can do it, because laws are not self-executing, right? They have to have some institution, and either that's a courts or a lawsuit or the Congress to come in and enforce the accountability.
But if this Republican-controlled Congress is not going to hold the president to account, I'm wondering how else could the president use this shutdown to push his political agenda?
Well, he has quite explicitly stated that the dismantling of the administrative state of the federal government is one of their goals. They have been doing that since the beginning of the term here, where they've had, they had the so-called DOGE, or Department of Government Efficiency, that temporarily went in, and we've already seen hundreds of thousands of federal employees either lose their jobs, be fired, take early retirements, all sorts of situations. And so we are seeing dramatic exodus and effects on the federal government workforce and the capacity of the federal government to engage in the vast breadth of responsibilities that government does. So this shutdown is potentially more kerosene on that fire to further expand the administrative's, the executive branch's effort to try to create a federal government that is both small and deeply loyal to the executive, rather than apolitical, apartisan, and expert in what they do.
We have reported, countless times on run-ups to a deadline, the threats of a possible government shutdown. Now we've got another shutdown actually taking place. I'm wondering, what does this shutdown do to the credibility of the United States abroad?
Well, that's hard to say. To some extent, Congress doesn't play a huge role in foreign affairs anymore. It's very difficult for Congress as a big body made up of many people to coordinate, to do things like negotiate trade agreements or peace agreements or whatever it might be, military agreements. And so the executive branch already kind of has an upper hand there. Will the executive branch be hampered because of losses at the State Department or other agencies of the federal government that get involved with trade and military affairs and negotiations and so forth internationally? I would think so. I would certainly think that the loss of personnel, the loss of expertise would hamper those effects. On the other hand, the philosophy that this administration follows when it comes to international agreements is one of transaction and gaining bilateral leverage over one another rather than building large multilateral coalitions. And so if you're just engaged in sort of this bilateral transactional one-on-one kind of politics that the president seems to prefer, maybe you can do that with a smaller force, and he prefers one that is deeply loyal, which does not, of course, fall in the democratic traditions or the foreign policy traditions that the United States has basically followed in the post-World War II era.
I'm going to ask you to look into your crystal ball for a moment here before we run out of time. How likely do you think it is that this shutdown could drag on for weeks, maybe months?
Yeah, so there's two sort of schools of thought on this. One school of thought is that the Democrats, while they are using the leverage that they have here, they don't have a ton of leverage. The Republicans really still do have the upper hand, and that Democrats may sort of cave. You know, they only need a few Democrats to peel off in order to end the shutdown. And so maybe they will be able to do that fairly quickly, and this will just last a few days. That is not an unlikely scenario, and that might make this a short-lived shutdown. The other school of thought is to say, well, actually, maybe the administration feels favored by a shutdown. Maybe they're not so eager to let it be short-lived, and they think they can get other either policy or political gains out of it. You know, the analysis of how the United States regime works right now is it much more operates like a competitive authoritarian regime rather than a democratic regime. And we've never had a government shutdown under a competitive authoritarian regime. So that to me suggests that there is a case to be made that this could be a quite long shutdown. The longest one we've ever had was the one in 2018 and 19. That was 35 days. It was pretty damaging. So we'll see if this one can sustain for that length of time or longer, or if we'll see something else. It's hard to say.
Yeah, well, the clock is definitely ticking. Jennifer Nicoll Victor from George Mason University. Professor, we appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I'm joined now by Tim Hagle. He's a political science professor at the University of Iowa. He joins me now from Iowa City. Professor, it's good to have you with us. So we have Democrats and Republicans playing the blame game over this shutdown. The Democrats say they want to keep health care costs down, while Republicans say the measures are simply too expensive and could be misused by illegal migrants. Why is this such a contentious issue?
Well, in part, it's a contentious issue because Democrats just don't want to give Trump and Republicans a victory at this point. That unfortunately, we're in such a point of partisan conflict that it's difficult to get anything through. Plus the fact that both chambers in the U.S. Congress, the House and the Senate, are so evenly divided that it's very difficult to get any legislation through, let alone the situation we have in the U.S. Senate, where it actually requires 60 votes to get any legislation passed. And right now we're stuck with the attempt to try to get a continuing resolution to just keep the government funded for a little bit. And even though it's a fairly clean resolution, Democrats are trying to use it as a way to try to increase the spending cuts or to restore the spending cuts that occurred in the prior legislation.
We know that in the past, the leader of the Democrats has been one to say, let's do everything to keep the government open. This time, it seems the Democrats are playing hardball with the Trump administration. Why are they changing their tactics now?
Well, they're basically on the other side of the equation. That in the past, it's always been Republicans that have sort of pushed this because they wanted to reduce the size of government, to reduce the federal spending because of concerns over the debt and the deficit. This time, the situation's reversed, where Republicans have, through Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill, have reduced spending in a variety of areas. And basically, Democrats say we want that some of those spending cuts restored. And now they're the ones that are advocating for a shutdown. And it may be that it come to their political detriment to do so.
We know that President Trump and some of his supporters are threatening retribution if Democrats do not fall in line. I'm wondering, are punitive actions such as mass firings of federal employees, would that be legal in the United States?
Well, it would be legal not so much in the context of a political retribution. That's not probably going to fly very well. But we know, of course, that the Trump administration had been trying to reduce the size of government for some time. That was the whole idea behind the Department of Government Efficiency, the DOGE, and they weren't able to do as many cuts as they wanted to. And so this gives them an opportunity to have another go at it in terms of saying, okay, well, if we're going to characterize these particular positions as non-essential, then maybe we don't need them at all, as opposed to just a pause.
I know that Trump has threatened to fire federal employees who are Democrats. We know that Trump's not going to be in power forever. Could he be setting a dangerous precedent that could then be used against Republicans in the future when a Democrat is in the White House?
That's absolutely true, and that's certainly something that some Republicans have been arguing, saying the whole idea of, well, what goes around comes around kind of a thing. The response from some in the Trump administration is that, well, we've already experienced that when the Democrats were in control, they used their levers of power, whether it was under the Obama administration or the Biden administration, to basically take out political retribution or to cause harm to conservatives and Republicans and so forth. And so from their perspective, at least, they see, well, this is our chance to sort of get even again. But again, does it just mean that it's a spiraling sort of thing every time the power changes? Unfortunately, that may be the case until one side or the other says, all right, enough of this. We need to basically grow up and behave.
Do you share the sentiment of the Vice President, J.D. Vance, who said today that he does not think that this will be a long shutdown?
Yeah, I can't really see that it's going to be long. The longest that we had was the one back 7 or so years ago, which was a little over 30 days. And at that point, things got very difficult because the longer these things go on, the more we start to see serious effects, whether things like, maybe air traffic control becomes a bit of an issue or whatever it happens to be. But right now, we're already seeing, as J.D. Vance, I saw in an interview earlier today, said that there's some cracks in sort of the Democratic caucus in the Senate, where 3 members of the Senate voted with Republicans to basically try to avoid a shutdown. So some of the members who have their political fortunes at stake on the Democratic side, Republicans too, but from the Democratic side, may be saying, well, maybe this isn't the right issue for us to basically die on politically.
Political science professor Tim Hagle from the University of Iowa. Professor, we appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.